is Caleb Friend, and my topic is aquatic biodiversity. We all know that about 2/3 of the world's surface is covered in water, but how much does this water actually affect us? According to G. Tyler Miller and Scott Spoolman's book, Living the Environment, Concepts, Connections, and Solutions, it can be valued at about roughly $21 trillion each year globally. So, what's so important is the ecological services that are provided through the different plants and animal species in the ocean. The key to keeping these services running is aquatic biodiversity, or all of the organisms working together, interacting as they would normally in their environments. So, this brings me to my main point, that aquatic biodiversity is important to human economic interests and can be negatively affected through pollution and invasive species. So aquatic biodiversity is important to human economic interests, namely fishing and tourism. With fishing, people generate money off of fish, and so they generally fish the tertiary consumer in an ecosystem because those are the largest and most profitable. When they overfish this biggest fish, this tertiary consumer, all the smaller organisms, the smaller fish that it would generally eat, there's nothing keeping them in check anymore, so their populations abound, and the producers that would normally provide them with food can't keep up with it, and as a result, the entire ecosystem dies off, and this dead ecosystem no longer provides any economical value for humans. The other way that aquatic biodiversity is important to economic interests is through tourism. People will travel because they're willing to see an interesting ecosystem. But if you lose the aquatic biodiversity, then suddenly it's not interesting as more. The complexity is gone, it's very simple, and people are no longer willing to travel there, and you lose your tourism revenue. So, if aquatic biodiversity is so important, what can negatively impact it? One thing is invasive species. Humans often accidentally introduce non-native species through an exchange of ballast water. Ballast water is water that's taken on a ship in a port to maintain a better level of buoyancy, and then it's later expelled back into the ocean at their destination port. This water often holds non-native organisms that are then put into this new environment and they invade it. They often reproduce rapidly, and there's nothing to keep them in check since they have no natural predators in this new environment. So with that being said, they take over a food source, and then eventually the producers can't keep up with it, and once again the whole economic system dies off. But as I was reading in an article titled Ballast Water Discharge Standard Rulemaking by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, ballast water is now being held to higher standards so that hopefully there will be less invasive species introduced. So an example of a destructive invasive species would be carp in Lake Wingra. Carp were accidentally introduced to the lake, and they started eating all this algae on the bottom of the lake. The algae used to hold down all the dirt and sediments, but with all the algae gone, because the carp were eating it, the sediments were stirred up into the water, and suddenly the water is much more cloudy than it used to be. This means that less sunlight is able to penetrate into the water, and that means that there's less plants in the lake as well, because they don't have enough light to create photosynthesis. So, with that being said, since there's less plants, there's less energy all around, and so there's less life in the lake. Another way that aquatic biodiversity can be negatively affected is through pollution. Pollution can harm the fragile environments of coastal areas, and pollution is often described as just being dumped in, negative things being dumped into the water, but it can also be runoff. As rain hits the water, it travels to streams, which travel to rivers, which travels to oceans. And so as water travels along the ground, it picks up herbicides, pesticides, all these other toxins that we use in our day-to-day lives, and that's carried to the ocean and hurts the fish that are living in those coastal areas. However, it's not just pollution. Pollution is not just toxins or other things. It's anything that's not natural, including nitrogen fertilizer. So nitrogen fertilizer, for example, gets carried into the ocean, and then it creates more algae and stuff that's in coastal areas because of the fertilizer. So crown of thorn starfish is a starfish that when they're young they eat algae, but when they're grown they eat the coral. And so there's more crown of thorn starfish now that are surviving to adulthood from the increase in algae, and now with all these grown starfish, they're now eating the coral faster than it can regenerate, which negatively affects the environment. There is a fact in a title called Coral Reef Threats where 90% of a reef was destroyed by such starfish in Fagatelli Bay, and that was written by Solcombe House. So that's another example of how pollution can negatively affect the environment. So in summary, aquatic biodiversity is important to human economic interests, and it can be negatively impacted through pollution and invasive species. The last thought on that being that since the environment is so intricate, it's important that humans come up with their own niche in the environment. Thank you.